First story. So, this happened a few years ago when I was living in a small apartment complex on the outskirts of town. The building was old, but the rent was cheap, so I couldn't complain too much. It was one of those places where you pretty much knew all your neighbors because the walls were so thin you could hear everyone's business, whether you wanted to or not. But it also meant that we sort of looked out for each other, at least when it was convenient. I've never been the handyman type, just your average guy with no clue how to fix anything beyond changing a light bulb. But I somehow found myself in a situation that made everyone in my building think I was some kind of plumbing wizard. Here's how it went down. It started on a Tuesday. I remember because that was my work from home day, and I had a pretty big project to focus on. I had barely opened my laptop when I heard a frantic knock on my door. It was Mrs. Diaz, the elderly woman from 2 floors down. She looked panicked and was talking so fast I could hardly keep up. Water, everywhere. The pipes. I don't know what to do. Help. I didn't even have time to explain that I had zero experience with plumbing before she grabbed my arm and pulled me down to her apartment. Sure enough, when we got there, water was gushing out from under her sink. Her kitchen floor was already starting to flood, and she was waving a towel around like that was somehow going to stop it. I didn't know what I was doing, but I figured I'd at least try to turn off the water. So I got down under her sink and twisted the valve. Thank God it worked. The water stopped, and she looked at me like I'd just performed a miracle. "You saved me." "You're a lifesaver," she said, practically in tears. I tried to explain that all I did was turn a valve, but she wasn't hearing it. By the time I left, she was convinced I had some magical knowledge of pipes. I thought that would be the end of it, but I couldn't have been more wrong. The next morning, I was woken up by another knock. This time it was Dan from across the hall. His bathroom sink was clogged, and apparently, Mrs. Diaz had told him I was the guy to go to for plumbing problems. I tried to tell him I wasn't a plumber, but he looked so desperate that I couldn't say no. I grabbed a plunger and headed over. It wasn't a serious clog, thankfully, just some hair stuck in the drain. I yanked it out and got the water flowing again. Dan was thrilled. "Man, you're a genius. I've been dealing with that clog for weeks." At this point, I was beginning to see where this was going. Word had spread, and before I knew it, half the building thought I was a professional plumber. It became a running joke between me and my roommate, Mike. Every time someone knocked on the door, he'd say, "Looks like another plumbing emergency for you, buddy." But the requests kept coming. One neighbor needed help fixing their toilet flush, another had a leaky faucet, and someone else's shower wasn't draining properly. I was way out of my depth, but somehow, I managed to fix everything by either Googling tutorials or just fiddling around with the pipes until something clicked. The funniest part was that every time I helped someone, they'd be so grateful they'd bring me random gifts. Mrs. Diaz baked me cookies, Dan gave me a 6-pack of beer, and someone else left a bottle of wine outside my door as a thank you. It felt like I was getting paid in snacks and alcohol for something I barely knew how to do. It all came to a head about a week later. I was out on the balcony, enjoying my newfound beer collection, when the landlord showed up. He looked furious. "I hear you've been doing plumbing work without a license," he said, arms crossed. I was caught off guard. I hadn't even considered the fact that what I was doing might not be legal, even though I was just trying to help my neighbors. "I'm not a plumber," I quickly explained. "I've just been helping out here and there when people had small issues." He wasn't having it. Apparently, one of the neighbors had mentioned me in passing, and he thought I was running some kind of underground plumbing business out of my apartment. I tried to explain the whole situation, but he just sighed and told me to knock it off before I made things worse. After that, I stopped answering the door anytime someone knocked with a plumbing problem. I went back to my normal, non-handyman life, and eventually, people stopped asking for help. Mrs. Diaz still brought me cookies every now and then, though, so I guess it wasn't all bad. Looking back, I still can't believe how quickly I went from a clueless guy to the unofficial building plumber. It was fun while it lasted, but I think I'll stick to my day job from now on. Second story. Alright, so this is one of those stories I look back on and laugh about now, but at the time, I was absolutely freaking out. It all started on a lazy Saturday morning. I was heading out for breakfast at my favorite diner when I noticed something odd in the alley behind my apartment building. There, parked neatly between the trash bins, was a sleek, black motorcycle. It wasn't unusual to see bikes around my neighborhood, but this one stuck out because I'd never seen it before, and it had no license plate. Now, I'm not a motorcycle guy, but this thing looked brand new, and it was the kind of bike you see in movies. Like, the kind someone would drive while fleeing a high-stakes bank robbery. My first thought was that it must belong to someone nearby. Maybe a neighbor just bought it and hadn't registered it yet? I didn't think too much of it at the time and went on with my day. Fast forward to later that afternoon. I'm coming back from lunch, and the bike's still there. No one around, no note, nothing. The thing is just sitting there, shiny and untouched. At this point, I'm starting to get suspicious, but I'm not the type to mess with other people's stuff. So I left it alone. But then, later that evening, I get a knock on my door. It's my neighbor, Tom, who lives a couple floors above me. He's a friendly enough guy, we've shared a few beers, but we don't know each other that well. He says he noticed the bike too and was wondering if I knew whose it was. I told him I had no clue, but we both agreed it was weird that it had been sitting there all day. Tom suggested we take a closer look. Normally, I wouldn't have bothered, but curiosity got the better of me. We headed down to the alley, and that's when I noticed something strange. There were no keys in the ignition, but the handlebar lock wasn't engaged. It was just sitting there, completely accessible. Should we call the cops? I asked. But Tom was already fiddling with the handlebars, clearly thinking the same thing I was. What if we just took it for a quick spin? Now, here's where I made my first mistake. Instead of thinking rationally, I got caught up in the moment. What's the harm? I thought. I mean, it wasn't like we were stealing the thing, it was just abandoned, right? Before I knew it, Tom had somehow managed to hotwire the bike. I still don't know how he knew what to do, but within seconds, the engine roared to life. The sound echoed through the alley, and I felt my heart race. I wasn't even on the bike, but the thrill of hearing that engine rev made me feel like I was in some kind of action movie. Tom looked over at me, grinning like a madman. "You want to take it for a ride?" he asked. I should have said no. But instead, I found myself saying, "Sure, why not?" We took turns riding the bike around the block, like a couple of idiots. It was exhilarating, I won't lie. For those brief moments, I felt invincible. It was like owning a piece of something I'd never be able to afford, something fast and dangerous. But then, things took a turn. While Tom was taking his turn on the bike, I heard sirens. Not just one, but multiple police cars speeding down the street toward us. I panicked and waved Tom down as he came around the corner. We quickly turned off the bike and shoved it back into the alley, hoping the cops weren't after us. But luck wasn't on our side. 2 patrol cars screeched to a stop right in front of the alley, and out came 4 officers, guns drawn. "Hands up!" "Step away from the vehicle," they shouted. I didn't even have time to process what was happening. My hand shot up faster than I thought was humanly possible, and Tom did the same. We were quickly cuffed and questioned right there on the spot. Apparently, the bike had been reported stolen the night before. The owner, some guy I'd never met, had left it outside his apartment only to have it swiped by some thief who ditched it in our alley. And here we were, like a couple of dumbass, playing around with it like it was ours. After what felt like hours of explaining ourselves and insisting we had no idea it was stolen, the cops finally let us go. They impounded the bike and told us to stay out of trouble. We didn't get arrested, but I've never been more relieved in my life. Tom and I didn't really talk much after that. He moved out a few months later, and I never asked him if he'd done anything like that before. As for me, I steer clear of anything remotely sketchy now, especially abandoned motorcycles. The moral of the story? If something seems too good to be true, it probably is. And stay away from motorcycles you don't own. You never know whose they are, or where they've been. Third story. I've never really been a dog person. Don't get me wrong, I think they're cute and all, but I just never grew up with pets, so I don't know the first thing about taking care of one. Yet somehow, one random Thursday night, I ended up babysitting my neighbor's dog after it made a grand escape. Here's how it happened. It was around 8 p.m., and I had just settled in for the night. The kind of night where you plan to do absolutely nothing. I was in my sweats, halfway through a Netflix binge, when I heard a scratching noise outside my front door. At first, I thought maybe it was the wind or something. I live in an apartment complex with those long, echoey hallways, so noises always get distorted. But then it came again, this time louder, more urgent. Curious, I got up, opened the door, and there he was, a big, fluffy golden retriever sitting there, wagging his tail and looking up at me like we were old friends. Now, I knew this dog. His name was Max, and he belonged to my neighbor, Sarah, who lived 2 doors down. Max was one of those dogs that had a huge personality. You know, the kind that acts like they own the entire building. I'd see him with Sarah all the time, pulling her down the hallway because she could barely control him when he got excited. The thing was, Sarah wasn't anywhere to be seen. Just Max, sitting there all proud of himself for escaping. I figured maybe she'd lost her grip on his leash and he'd wandered off. But there was no leash. This dog had clearly made a clean getaway. I'm standing there in my doorway, trying to figure out what to do. Max, meanwhile, decides that he's just going to invite himself into my apartment. Before I could react, he trots right past me and starts sniffing around like he's inspecting the place. My apartment wasn't exactly dog-proofed, and suddenly I'm nervous he's going to knock something over. Sarah? I called down the hallway, hoping she'd come running after her dog. No response. I pulled out my phone and shot her a quick text, "Hey, Max is in my apartment, everything okay?" I didn't hear back right away, so I figured maybe she was out looking for him and didn't have her phone on her. Meanwhile, Max had made himself comfortable on my couch, looking completely content with his new surroundings. I have to admit, it was kind of cute seeing him just lounging there like he owned the place. But I knew I had to get him back to Sarah. I tried coaxing him off the couch, but he wasn't having it. Instead, he stretched out, closed his eyes, and let out this big, dramatic sigh like he'd been running a marathon. I was not prepared for this level of stubbornness. After a few more failed attempts to get him off the couch, I decided to try something else. I went to my kitchen, grabbed a slice of deli ham from the fridge, and waved it in front of his nose. His eyes snapped open, and within seconds, he was off the couch, tail wagging, following me like I was his new best friend. I figured I'd lead him back to Sarah's place with the ham. Simple enough, right? Wrong. When I opened the door to my apartment, Max bolted. Like, full sprint down the hallway. I ran after him, ham still in hand, as he darted toward the elevator. At this point, I'm in full panic mode because the last thing I need is for this dog to get outside and disappear into the night. Just as Max reached the elevator, the doors opened, and out stepped Sarah. She looked as surprised as I was. "Oh my God, Max! There you are," she exclaimed, rushing over to grab his collar. Max, meanwhile, was completely oblivious to the chaos he'd caused. He was wagging his tail, still focused on the ham I was holding. I handed the slice to Sarah, and she gave it to him as a peace offering while apologizing profusely to me. "I'm so sorry." He slipped out when I was taking out the trash. "I didn't even realize he'd run off until I came back inside," she explained. I waved it off, saying it was no big deal, but honestly, my heart was still racing from the chase. Sarah thanked me again, and I thought that was the end of it. But no, Max wasn't done with me yet. The next morning, I woke up to more scratching at my door. I opened it, and there he was again, Max, tail wagging, looking as happy as ever. Apparently, he'd made me his new favorite person. I texted Sarah again, and this time she came right away to retrieve him, looking equally embarrassed as the night before. This continued for a couple more days. Every morning, like clockwork, Max would escape, come scratch at my door, and I'd text Sarah to come pick him up. It was starting to feel like I was running an unofficial doggy daycare. By the end of the week, Sarah had finally gotten a stronger leash and managed to keep Max from escaping again. But those few days made me realize how chaotic owning a dog could be. It also made me appreciate the little bonds we form with our neighbors, even if they're furry and unintentional. I still see Max around the building sometimes, and every time he spots me, his tail starts wagging like crazy. I think he's convinced we're best friends now. Sarah still apologizes for all the trouble he caused, but honestly, it's become a running joke between us. So, yeah, that's the story of how I became an accidental dog sitter for a few days. And while I'm still not a dog person, I have to admit, Max kinda won me over.